Welcome back to the Truth Chronicles, where we delve into the fascinating lives and stories of influential figures throughout history. Today, we're excited to explore the life and works of one of the most renowned playwrights and poets in the English language, William Shakespeare. From his humble beginnings in Stratford upon Avon to his remarkable career in the London theatre scene, Shakespeare has left an indelible mark on literature and the arts. Join us as we journey through his life, uncover the secrets behind his iconic works, and discover why his legacy continues to inspire and captivate audiences around the world. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into the world of the bard himself, William Shakespeare. Shakespeare was the son of John Shakespeare, an alderman and a successful glovemaker, originally from Snitterfield in Warwickshire, and Mary Arden, the daughter of an affluent landowning family. He was born in Stratford upon Avon, where he was baptized on 26 April 1564. His date of birth is unknown, but is traditionally observed on 23 April St. George's Day. This date, which can be traced to William Oldies and George Steevens, has proved appealing to biographers because Shakespeare died on the same date in 1616. He was the third of 8 children and the eldest surviving son. Although no attendance records for the period survive, most biographers agree that Shakespeare was probably educated at the King's New School in Stratford, a free school chartered in 1553, about a quarter-mile, 400 miles, from his home. Grammar schools varied in quality during the Elizabethan era, but grammar school curricula were largely similar. The basic Latin text was standardized by royal decree, and the school would have provided an intensive education in grammar based upon Latin classical authors. At the age of 18, Shakespeare married 26-year-old Anne Hathaway. The consistory court of the Diocese of Worcester issued a marriage license on 27 November 1582. The next day, 2 of Hathaway's neighbors posted bonds guaranteeing that no lawful claims impeded the marriage. The ceremony may have been arranged in some haste, since the Worcester chancellor allowed the marriage banns to be read once instead of the usual 3 times, and 6 months after the marriage, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Susanna, baptized 26 May 1583. Twins, son Hamnet and daughter Judith, followed almost 2 years later and were baptized 2 February 1585. Hamnet died of unknown causes at the age of 11 and was buried 11 August 1596. After the birth of the twins, Shakespeare left few historical traces until he is mentioned as part of the London theatre scene in 1592. The exception is the appearance of his name in the Complaints Bill of a law case before the Queen's Bench Court at Westminster, dated Michaelmas term 1588 and 9 October 1589. Scholars refer to the years between 1585 and 1592 as Shakespeare's lost years. Biographers attempting to account for this period have reported many apocryphal stories. Nicholas Rowe, Shakespeare's first biographer, recounted a Stratford legend that Shakespeare fled the town for London to escape prosecution for deer poaching in the estate of local squire Thomas Lucy. Shakespeare is also supposed to have taken his revenge on Lucy by writing a scurrilous ballad about him. Another 18th century story has Shakespeare starting his theatrical career minding the horses of theater patrons in London. John Aubrey reported that Shakespeare had been a country schoolmaster. Some 20th century scholars suggested that Shakespeare may have been employed as a schoolmaster by Alexander Houghton of Lancashire, a Catholic landowner who named a certain William Shakeshaft in his will. Little evidence substantiates such stories other than hearsay collected after his death, and Shakeshaft was a common name in the Lancashire area. It is not known definitively when Shakespeare began writing, but contemporary allusions and records of performances show that several of his plays were on the London stage by 1592. By then, he was sufficiently known in London to be attacked in print by the playwright Robert Greene in his Groat's Worth of Wit from that year. There is an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you. And being an absolute Johannes factotum, is in his own conceit the only Shake scene in a country. Scholars differ on the exact meaning of Green's words, but most agree that Green was accusing Shakespeare of reaching above his rank in trying to match such university-educated writers as Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Nash, and Green himself, the so-called university wits. The italicized phrase parodying the line, "O tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide," from Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 3, along with the pun "Shake scene," clearly identify Shakespeare as Green's target. As used here, Johannes factotum, jack of all trades, refers to a second-rate tinkerer with the work of others, rather than the more common universal genius. Green's attack is the earliest surviving mention of Shakespeare's work in the theater. Biographers suggest that his career may have begun any time from the mid-1580s to just before Green's remarks. After 1594, Shakespeare's plays were performed only by the Lord Chamberlain's men, a company owned by a group of players, including Shakespeare, that soon became the leading playing company in London. After the death of Queen Elizabeth in 1603, the company was awarded a royal patent by the new King James I and changed its name to the King's Men. In 1599, a partnership of members of the company built their own theater on the south bank of the River Thames, which they named the Globe. In 1608, the partnership also took over the Blackfriars Indoor Theatre. Extant records of Shakespeare's property purchases and investments indicate that his association with the company made him a wealthy man, and in 1597, he bought the second-largest house in Stratford New Place, and in 1605, invested in a share of the parish tithes in Stratford. Some of Shakespeare's plays were published in quarto editions beginning in 1594, and by 1598, his name had become a selling point and began to appear on the title pages. Shakespeare continued to act in his own and other plays after his success as a playwright. The 1616 edition of Ben Jonson's works names him on the cast lists for Every Man in His Humor, 1598, and Sejanus His Fall, 1603. The absence of his name from the 1605 cast list for Jonson's Volpone is taken by some scholars as a sign that his acting career was nearing its end. The first folio of 1623, however, lists Shakespeare as one of the principal actors in all these plays, some of which were first staged after Volpone, although one cannot know for certain which roles he played. In 1610, John Davies of Hereford wrote that Good Will played kingly roles. In 1709, Rowe passed down a tradition that Shakespeare played the ghost of Hamlet's father. Later traditions maintain that he also played Adam in As You Like It and the chorus in Henry V, though scholars doubt the sources of that information. Throughout his career, Shakespeare divided his time between London and Stratford. In 1596, the year before he bought New Place as his family home in Stratford, Shakespeare was living in the parish of St. Helens, Bishopsgate, north of the River Thames. He moved across the river to Southwark by 1599, the same year his company constructed the Globe Theatre there. By 1604, he had moved north of the river again, to an area north of St. Paul's Cathedral with many fine houses. There, he rented rooms from a French Huguenot named Christopher Mountjoy, a maker of women's wigs and other headgear. Nicholas Rowe was the first biographer to record the tradition, repeated by Samuel Johnson, that Shakespeare retired to Stratford some years before his death. He was still working as an actor in London in 1608. In an answer to the Sharers' petition in 1635, Cuthbert Burbage stated that after purchasing the lease of the Blackfriars Theatre in 1608 from Henry Evans, the King's Men placed men players there, which were Heminges, Condell, Shakespeare, etc. However, it is perhaps relevant that the bubonic plague raged in London throughout 1609. The London public playhouses were repeatedly closed during extended outbreaks of the plague, a total of over 60 months closure between May 1603 and February 1610, which meant there was often no acting work. Retirement from all work was uncommon at that time. Shakespeare continued to visit London during the years 1611-1614. In 1612, he was called as a witness in Bailot Viraf Mountjoy, a court case concerning the marriage settlement of Mountjoy's daughter, Mary. In March 1613, he bought a gatehouse in the former Blackfriars Priory, and from November 1614, he was in London for several weeks with his son-in-law, John Hall. After 1610, Shakespeare wrote fewer plays, and none are attributed to him after 1613. His last 3 plays were collaborations, probably with John Fletcher, who succeeded him as the house playwright of the King's Men. He retired in 1613, before the Globe Theatre burned down during the performance of Henry VIII on 29 June. Shakespeare died on 23 April 1616, at the age of 52. He died within a month of signing his will, a document which he begins by describing himself as being in perfect health. No extant contemporary source explains how or why he died. Half a century later, John Ward, the vicar of Stratford, wrote in his notebook, "Shakespeare, Drayton, and Ben Jonson had a merry meeting and, it seems, drank too hard, for Shakespeare died of a fever there contracted. Not an impossible scenario, since Shakespeare knew Jonson and Drayton." Of the tributes from fellow authors, one refers to his relatively sudden death. "We wondered, Shakespeare, that thou wentst so soon, from the world's stage to the grave's tiring room." He was survived by his wife and 2 daughters. Susanna had married a physician, John Hall, in 1607, and Judith had married Thomas Quiney, a vintner, 2 months before Shakespeare's death. Shakespeare signed his last will and testament on 25 March 1616. The following day, Thomas Quiney, his new son-in-law, was found guilty of fathering an illegitimate son by Margaret Wheeler, both of whom had died during childbirth. Thomas was ordered by the church court to do public penance, which would have caused much shame and embarrassment for the Shakespeare family. Shakespeare bequeathed the bulk of his large estate to his elder daughter Susanna, under stipulations that she pass it down intact to the first son of her body. The Quinneys had 3 children, all of whom died without marrying. The Halls had 1 child, Elizabeth, who married twice but died without children in 1670, ending Shakespeare's direct line. Shakespeare's will scarcely mentions his wife, Anne, who was probably entitled to 1/3 of his estate automatically. He did make a point, however, of leaving her "my second best bed," a bequest that has led to much speculation. Some scholars see the bequest as an insult to Anne, whereas others believe that the second best bed would have been the matrimonial bed, and therefore rich in significance. Shakespeare was buried in the chancel of the Holy Trinity Church 2 days after his death. The epitaph carved into the stone slab covering his grave includes a curse against moving his bones, which was carefully avoided during restoration of the church in 2008. It means, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake, forbear, to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." Sometime before 1623, a funerary monument was erected in his memory on the north wall, with a half-effigy of him in the act of writing. Its plaque compares him to Nestor, Socrates, and Virgil. In 1623, in conjunction with the publication of the first folio, the Droeshout engraving was published. Shakespeare has been commemorated in many statues and memorials around the world, including funeral monuments in Southwark Cathedral and Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. Most playwrights of the period typically collaborated with others at some point, as critics agree Shakespeare did, mostly early and late in his career. The first recorded works of Shakespeare are Richard III and the 3 parts of Henry VI, written in the early 1590s during a vogue for historical drama. Shakespeare's plays are difficult to date precisely, however, and studies of the texts suggest that Titus Andronicus, The Comedy of Errors, The Taming of the Shrew, and The Two Gentlemen of Verona may also belong to Shakespeare's earliest period. His first histories, which draw heavily on the 1587 edition of Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, dramatize the destructive results of weak or corrupt rule, and have been interpreted as a justification for the origins of the Tudor dynasty. The early plays were influenced by the works of other Elizabethan dramatists, especially Thomas Kyd and Christopher Marlowe, by the traditions of medieval drama, and by the plays of Seneca. The Comedy of Errors was also based on classical models, but no source for the taming of the shrew has been found, though it is related to a separate play of the same name and may have derived from a folk story. Like The Two Gentlemen of Verona, in which two friends appear to approve of rape, the shrew's story of the taming of a woman's independent spirit by a man sometimes troubles modern critics, directors, and audiences. Shakespeare's early classical and Italianate comedies, containing tight double plots and precise comic sequences, give way in the mid-1590s to the romantic atmosphere of his most acclaimed comedies. A Midsummer Night's Dream is a witty mixture of romance, fairy magic, and comic low-life scenes. Shakespeare's next comedy, the equally romantic Merchant of Venice, contains a portrayal of the vengeful Jewish moneylender Shylock, which reflects dominant Elizabethan views but may appear derogatory to modern audiences. The wit and wordplay of Much Ado About Nothing, the charming rural setting of As You Like It, and the lively merrymaking of Twelfth Night complete Shakespeare's sequence of great comedies. After the lyrical Richard II, written almost entirely in verse, Shakespeare introduced prose comedy into the histories of the late 1590s, Henry IV, Parts 1 and 2, and Henry V. His characters become more complex and tender as he switches deftly between comic and serious scenes, prose and poetry, and achieves the narrative variety of his mature work. This period begins and ends with two tragedies, Romeo and Juliet, the famous romantic tragedy of sexually charged adolescence, love, and death, and Julius Caesar, based on Sir Thomas North's 1579 translation of Plutarch's Parallel Lives, which introduced a new kind of drama. According to Shakespearean scholar James Shapiro in Julius Caesar, the various strands of politics, character, inwardness, contemporary events, even Shakespeare's own reflections on the act of writing, began to infuse each other. In the early 17th century, Shakespeare wrote the so-called problem plays, Measure for Measure, Troilus and Cressida, and All's Well That Ends Well, and a number of his best-known tragedies. Many critics believe that Shakespeare's greatest tragedies represent the peak of his art. The titular hero of one of Shakespeare's greatest tragedies, Hamlet, has probably been discussed more than any other Shakespearean character, especially for his famous soliloquy which begins, "To be or not to be, that is the question." Unlike the introverted Hamlet, whose fatal flaw is hesitation, the heroes of the tragedies that followed, Othello and King Lear, are undone by hasty errors of judgment. The plots of Shakespeare's tragedies often hinge on such fatal errors or flaws, which overturn order and destroy the hero and those he loves. In Othello, the villain Iago stokes Othello's sexual jealousy to the point where he murders the innocent wife who loves him. In King Lear, the old king commits the tragic error of giving up his powers, initiating the events which lead to the torture and blinding of the Earl of Gloucester and the murder of Lear's youngest daughter, Cordelia. According to the critic Frank Kermode, the play offers neither its good characters nor its audience any relief from its cruelty. In Macbeth, the shortest and most compressed of Shakespeare's tragedies, uncontrollable ambition incites Macbeth and his wife, Lady Macbeth, to murder the rightful king and usurp the throne until their own guilt destroys them in turn. In this play, Shakespeare adds a supernatural element to the tragic structure. His last major tragedies, Antony and Cleopatra and Coriolanus, contain some of Shakespeare's finest poetry and were considered his most successful tragedies by the poet and critic T.S. Eliot. In his final period, Shakespeare turned to romance or tragicomedy and completed 3 more major plays: Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest, as well as the collaboration Pericles, Prince of Tyre. Less bleak than the tragedies, these 4 plays are graver in tone than the comedies of the 1590s, but they end with reconciliation and the forgiveness of potentially tragic errors. Some commentators have seen this change in mood as evidence of a more serene view of life on Shakespeare's part, but it may merely reflect the theatrical fashion of the day. Shakespeare collaborated on 2 further surviving plays, Henry VIII and The Two Noble Kinsmen, probably with John Fletcher. William Shakespeare was an English playwright, poet, and actor, widely regarded as the greatest writer in the English language and the world's preeminent dramatist. Shakespeare's plays are still performed more often than those of any other playwright. They have been performed in every possible medium, from theater and film to radio, television, and animation. Many of Shakespeare's plays were based on pre-existing sources, such as chronicles, other plays, and historical or biographical accounts. Some of his most famous plays, including Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, and Macbeth, were derived from such sources. Poems, sonnets. Shakespeare is also known for his sonnets, a form of poetry that was popular in the Elizabethan era. His sonnets are typically 14 lines long and explore themes of love, beauty, politics, and mortality. The most famous of his sonnets is probably Sonnet 18, which begins, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" Shakespeare's first plays were written in the conventional style of the day. He wrote them in a stylized language that does not always spring naturally from the needs of the characters or the drama. The poetry depends on extended, sometimes elaborate metaphors and conceits, and the language is often rhetorical, written for actors to declaim rather than speak. The grand speeches in Titus Andronicus, in the view of some critics, often hold up the action, for example, and the verse in The Two Gentlemen of Verona has been described as stilted. However, Shakespeare soon began to adapt the traditional styles to his own purposes. The opening soliloquy of Richard III has its roots in the self-declaration of vice in medieval drama. At the same time, Richard's vivid self-awareness looks forward to the soliloquies of Shakespeare's mature plays. No single play marks a change from the traditional to the freer style. Shakespeare combined the two throughout his career, with Romeo and Juliet perhaps the best example of the mixing of the styles. By the time of Romeo and Juliet, Richard II, and A Midsummer Night's Dream in the mid-1590s, Shakespeare had begun to write a more natural poetry. He increasingly tuned his metaphors and images to the needs of the drama itself. Shakespeare's standard poetic form was blank verse, composed in iambic pentameter. In practice, this meant that his verse was usually unrhymed and consisted of 10 syllables to a line, spoken with a stress on every second syllable. The blank verse of his early plays is quite different from that of his later ones. It is often beautiful, but its sentences tend to start, pause, and finish at the end of lines with the risk of monotony. Once Shakespeare mastered traditional blank verse, he began to interrupt and vary its flow. This technique releases the new power and flexibility of the poetry in plays such as Julius Caesar and Hamlet. Shakespeare uses it, for example, to convey the turmoil in Hamlet's mind. "Sir, in my heart there was a kind of fighting that would not let me sleep. Methought I lay worse than the mutins in the bilboes. Rashly, and praised be rashness for it, let us know our indiscretion sometimes serves us well." After Hamlet, Shakespeare varied his poetic style further, particularly in the more emotional passages of the late tragedies. The literary critic A.C. Bradley described this style as more concentrated, rapid, varied, and, in construction, less regular, not seldom twisted or elliptical. In the last phase of his career, Shakespeare adopted many techniques to achieve these effects. These included run-on lines, irregular pauses and stops, and extreme variations in sentence structure and length. In Macbeth, for example, the language darts from one unrelated metaphor or simile to another. Was the hope drunk, wherein you dressed yourself? 1.735-38. Pity, like a naked newborn babe, striding the blast, or heaven's cherubim, horsed, upon the sightless couriers of the air. 1.721-25. The listener is challenged to complete the sense. The late romances, with their shifts in time and surprising turns of plot, inspired a last poetic style in which long and short sentences are set against one another, clauses are piled up, subject and object are reversed, and words are omitted, creating an effect of spontaneity. Shakespeare combined poetic genius with a practical sense of the theater. Like all playwrights of the time, he dramatized stories from sources such as Plutarch and Holinshed. He reshaped each plot to create several centers of interest and to show as many sides of a narrative to the audience as possible. This strength of design ensures that a Shakespeare play can survive translation, cutting, and wide interpretation without loss to its core drama. As Shakespeare's mastery grew, he gave his characters clearer and more varied motivations and distinctive patterns of speech. He preserved aspects of his earlier style in the later plays, however. In Shakespeare's late romances, he deliberately returned to a more artificial style, which emphasized the illusion of theater. Shakespeare has had a profound influence on literature, language, and culture. His works have inspired countless adaptations, reinterpretations, and responses in every artistic medium. He has given the English language many new words and phrases, and his plays are still studied and performed worldwide. Shakespeare's critical reputation has fluctuated over the centuries, with some periods viewing him as a flawed and uneven writer, while others have hailed him as a literary genius. Today, he is widely regarded as one of the greatest writers in the English language, and his works are studied and performed around the world. Despite the overwhelming evidence of his authorship, there has been some speculation over the years that Shakespeare did not write his own plays. Some have suggested that the works were written by someone else, such as Francis Bacon or the Earl of Oxford. However, most scholars agree that Shakespeare wrote his own plays. Shakespeare's religious beliefs are not fully known, but he was baptized and buried in the Church of England. Some scholars have suggested that he may have harbored Catholic sympathies, given the religious tensions of the time and the fact that his mother's family was Catholic. However, there is no clear evidence to support this theory, and Shakespeare's works do not contain any overtly Catholic themes. There are a few passing references to religion in Shakespeare's plays, but they are generally oblique and do not suggest any particular religious affiliation. For example, in Hamlet, the character Polonius advises his son Laertes to "neither a borrower nor a lender be, for loan oft loses both itself and friend, and borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry." This passage contains a reference to a well-known biblical passage from Proverbs 22:7, but it is not a clear statement of Christian belief. Overall, Shakespeare's religious views remain a mystery, and scholars continue to debate the significance of his work's religious references. Nevertheless, his plays and sonnets remain an important part of the English literary canon, and they continue to be studied, performed, and admired by people of all faiths and backgrounds. Shakespeare's sexuality has been the subject of much debate and speculation. While there is no concrete evidence to suggest that he was gay or bisexual, some of his sonnets and plays contain homoerotic themes and language. For example, Sonnet 18, which begins, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" is addressed to a young man, and there are several references to male-male desire in his plays, such as the relationship between Antonio and Sebastian in The Twelfth Night. However, it is important to note that these interpretations are not universally accepted, and many scholars believe that Shakespeare's works simply reflect the complexities and ambiguities of human desire and love. There are several portraits of Shakespeare that are believed to be authentic, including the so-called Chandos portrait and the Droeshout engraving that appears in the first folio of his works. However, there are also many other portraits that have been attributed to Shakespeare over the years, and the authenticity of some of these images is still a matter of debate. Many of these portraits depict Shakespeare with a prominent forehead, dark hair, and a beard, and they are an important part of his cultural legacy. However, much remains unknown about his physical appearance, and many of the portraits that have been attributed to him are based on incomplete or unreliable evidence. Thank you for joining me on the Truth Chronicles, where we dive deep into the lives and works of the world's greatest thinkers and creators. Today, we explored the life and legacy of William Shakespeare, one of the most influential writers in the English language. From his plays and sonnets to his unknown personal life, Shakespeare remains a fascinating and mysterious figure whose works continue to inspire and challenge us today. So if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to the Truth Chronicles, and stay tuned for more videos about the people who have shaped our world. And as Shakespeare himself once wrote, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players." Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.